back for whatever reason. So I want to welcome you today and talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about probably the number one question we get at the FAA from public safety folks, and that's whether or not they should operate as a Part 107 operator with a remote pilot certificate, or if they should operate as a public aircraft operation or a Part 91 operation with a certificate of authorization. And you're going to hear from different people today. They're going to talk about the pros, the cons, the lessons learned about operating either way. And the simple answer you're going to hear when you ask that question, what should I operate under, whether 107 or Part 91 COA, the answer is going to be, it depends. It depends on what airspace you're flying in. It depends on what kind of operation you're going to do. There's a lot of additional questions that have to be answered before we can give you sort of a good answer. But hopefully you'll get some good lessons learned here. You'll make some context here. You'll get some resources here. And that can help you answer your questions and help you guys with your programs. We got a really great panel today. We've got myself. I'm important in my own mind. I'm Mike O'Shea. I'm the Public Safety Engagement person from the Office of Unmanned Aircraft Systems Integration Office. I've been with the FAA now for about a year and a half. Prior to that, I spent 18 years at the Department of Justice supporting public safety operations. And prior to that, I was a sheriff's deputy in Topeka, Kansas. So I've got about 30 plus years in public safety. And the best thing I can do, the best job I've ever had is working with and for public safety. So I really enjoy doing this kind of stuff. Like I said, the number one question we have is hopefully will be answered for you guys today. We have sort of a unique panel. We have Karen Petronas. She's our senior attorney for regulations. She's been with the FAA for 31 years. If you've had legal questions about unmanned aircraft systems, you may have run into Karen. She's absolutely very, very helpful. Next, we have Rick Hasna. I've known Rick for 2 months. I've known Rick for a long time. Rick is retired from the Oakland, California Police Department, where he was lieutenant. He ran their aviation unit. He ran their special operations group. When he retired, he went to work for the Alameda County Sheriff's Department and is their chief pilot. Alameda County was a really early adopter of this technology, and they, like I like to say, they made all the mistakes so that they could make their program great. And I always throw Rick's name out. If you need to talk to somebody about fire operations, police operations, and basically somebody who sort of wrote the book on how it's done, Rick is the guy to talk to. And I will tell you, the sheriff of Alameda County has been great, letting Rick and Tom Madigan and all the other folks in the unmanned aircraft systems program there support other public safety agencies with their operations and everything from they flew all the fires in California, they helped wrote the POST program in California for UAS operations. They're a really good, helpful resource. Next is Charles Warner. Charles is the retired fire chief from Charlottesville, Virginia. I think I've known you for about 5 years. Starting when he was ending his career in Charlottesville and starting his career working with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. And when they put on a great conference, have you ever been to the conference in Crozet, Virginia? They had me, but when they decided they were having the conference at a vineyard, probably not a good place for public safety folks to go for a conference, but they do a really, really great job and put on a really great conference, the state of Virginia, that is. And last is Bob Brock. Bob is retired from the Air Force. He's a pilot. And he is now the director of aviation for the great state of Kansas. I have to point out, since that's where I originally came from. And he's going to give you some unique perspectives on what it means to be sort of a non-public safety public aircraft operator for operations. So first up is Karen, and Karen's going to talk to us a little bit about the regulations with unmanned aircraft systems.
Not regulations.
Rules, laws, statutes.
Statutes. Thank you very much. See, I have these great straight lines that do this for me. Oh, look, it's a title page. It was. My name is Karen Petronas. I am Senior Attorney for Regulations at FAA headquarters. As of July 3rd, I will have been at the agency 31 years. I have been the attorney for public aircraft operations since February of 2009. Which pretty much takes in most of what UAS is or has become. Possibly, and I'm also the attorney I'm the public aircraft attorney, but I now have a second in command. It is very exciting. If you get to talk to him, his name is Francisco Castillo, or we know him as Fran. He learns fast, and he's my backup, which I'd never had before. I love Fran, and I'm sorry he couldn't be with us today. Probably the most fascinating thing I've heard recently is that 95% of the people who are doing UAS public aircraft operations and operate off-the-shelf consumer-grade drones have no aviation background. So these are not people coming out of the helicopter world, coming out of private pilots. These are people who bought a drone off Amazon. And it's like, oh, I'm a public entity, I get to operate. That's very scary for us. The public aircraft statute itself goes back to the land before time. Back in the 1980s, it was a very different piece of legislation, and Congress has piecemealed it together since then. But most people, even people who are aviation people in practicing, don't know the difference between our statutory authority and what is FAA regulatory authority. Statutes are things that roll down the hill. They're on stone tablets. They roll down the hill to us from Congress, and we can't change them. We get to implement what they said. We have to guess the best we can on what they said. What you might be more used to is our regulations, which are cited as 14 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Most of those do not apply to public aircraft operation because Congress did not give us the authority to regulate public aircraft operations. This is very deep lawyer stuff. If you want to talk about it, we can. I'm going to kind of skip over it. But what we're talking about is your ability to operate, your authority under which you conduct public aircraft operations, or indeed if you choose to do civil. It applies to absolutely every flight of your aircraft. So I'm going to rip through this. What does it take to qualify? And that's the big word on public aircraft operation. It means you are a government entity of some ilk that is defined in 49 U.S.C. 40102-841. It's federal, it's state, it's the military, and there is a new provision in 2018 for Indian tribes who get to operate UAS only and not manned. One of the problems with the public aircraft statute is it has to cover everybody for everything. So it's manned operations of helicopters, it is unmanned UAS, it's everything a government entity decides to do and fly with. The qualifications are significant, as are the limits on the qualifications of public aircraft. In any one of those definitions, it says, the aircraft described does not qualify as a public aircraft under such section when the aircraft is used for commercial purposes or to carry an individual other than a crew member or a qualified non-crew member. I don't even have to read this, it's ingrained in my head. So the big question is always commercial purpose. The term commercial purpose has a very broad meaning in the FAA. It is well established under civil aircraft regulation what it means. We apply the same definition and possibly even tighter to public aircraft. And it means the transportation of persons or property for compensation or hire. If you know anything about aviation, you've heard that phrase. That prohibition on the public aircraft side is absolute. But wait, there's more. Not only can you not have a commercial purpose and you have to be a qualified government entity, you need a governmental function for every one of your flights. And that is not what you choose to do. It is defined in the statute. That full site is Title 49 of the United States Code, Section 40125 is the guts of the public aircraft statute. And there's a nice definition sitting in A2 what governmental function means. And if you read that list, it's pretty limited. It is also the one that you can trip over the easiest. And and this is very much UAS, we have mission creep from the person who got the authority to people who just want to use that UAS for something else. This is where mission creep can come in and disqualify you from public aircraft operation without you doing much of anything or thinking about it, and indeed that's the problem. So governments can't just do government stuff. Not everything a government entity chooses to do is a governmental function for the purposes of operating a public aircraft. No, you don't get to make stuff up because you are Cook County, Illinois, or Keokuk, Iowa, or Dallas, Texas. You do not get to make up your own idea of, I work for the government, therefore everything I do is a government operation. The list in the statute is not exclusive because lawyers will ping it and say it says such as, but the FAA is the one who gets to do the interpretation. It is still our statute to oversee, so we get to say what constitutes a governmental function. So who gets to, there we go. Who does not qualify? These are the ones we have to say no to all the time. Volunteer fire departments, universities and schools that are not public or attached to the state. The Civil Air Patrol. How many people think the Civil Air Patrol is a government entity? They're not. Neither is the American Red Cross. No, any charitable organization that's 501c3 is not a government entity. Nonprofits are not government entities. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, by their title. Most people don't even know what NGO means when they refer to them. Any operation outside U.S. airspace, and if you don't know what U.S. airspace is because you've never operated an aircraft before and you just got your brand new drone, it's time to figure it out. And any government entity that seeks compensation for operating the aircraft. The big things on, my slide changed from what I have. What's not a valid governmental function? So police, fire, transportation of prisoners, which isn't yet a UAS-based thing. But what is not? Education activities of any kind. You can't run a UAS flight school. You can't use UAS to teach and call it a government function. You can do it civil. All of these things that are here that says not a valid government function means you should be operating under Part 91 or 107. You can't do research. You can't do aeronautical research, which is a term of art under the statute that a lot of people try and qualify to use. And as soon as that aircraft is functional for its purposes you're researching, you're done. Your public aircraft authority has expired. Most public works projects are right out. No looking at roads or buildings under construction, plotting and surveying land, deciding where a cell tower that's going to be for police use is not necessarily a governmental function. It's a construction project. Photography, public relations, tourism, demonstration flights at the county fair by the police department, inspection of state-owned utilities. Some of our big western states actually own part of the utility generation and distribution. That is not a governmental function under the statute, even though they own it. Operation of airports, no matter who you are, that is not a governmental function. Transportation of transplant organs. That one's new, but I thought I'd bring it up because it just happened. So, what happens if you violate the public aircraft statute? You can't. You can never violate the statute because as soon as you don't meet one of the qualifications, you fail to qualify. And if you fail to qualify on any flight for any reason under that statute, you're a civil aircraft. And if you're a civil aircraft, all of a sudden, all of those 14 CFR regulations that refer to UAS operation, to any kind of operation, are on you. So you trip out of this, and you've done something non-governmental function, you're now probably Part 107. And if you're 107, your pilot better be trained. You better have all that stuff. You better know all those regulations you're operating under now. If you're suddenly a civil operator, you're subject to all the civil penalties and all the regulations. And no, you can't be part part PAO, part 107. It's not like, oh, we're out being PAO and hey, we're going to go look at the people at the county fair and take pictures because the people want to see how many people were there. It's not necessarily a governmental function anymore. And you technically have to land the aircraft and declare it something else and be qualified to do it. And just in case there's any dispute, the FAA can and will take action against the pilot of a public aircraft operation, even when it's perfectly valid, if he violates some of the rules. So, what's the difference between being civil and being public? If you're public, it means, and this is a good checklist, you're a government entity. Your flight has a governmental function, limited by statute. The operation is determined on a flight-by-flight basis. So every time you're about to launch your UAS, you need to know what your operating authority is. Am I taking off PAO? Am I taking off 107? You're not subject to the aircraft airworthiness requirements or any of the pilot requirements in all 14 CFR, and that includes 107, but you always take on all of the responsibility and all of the liability for the operation. You are subject to the all aircraft rules of Part 91. Again, if you are not aviation oriented, there is a chunk of rules in Part 91 that are called the all aircraft rules. They are the big safety rules. They're the minimum safe altitude, careless and reckless, all of the things that apply to all aircraft. I can go into those if you want to talk to me separately about it. I'm not going to do it here. You cannot be compensated. You cannot charge anyone for an operation. You can't get back costs. You can't carry passengers, which will happen someday. And if you fail, you're civil, and all of 14 CFR applies. So that's what it means to be a public aircraft operator. When you're a civil operator, you can be anyone. Every government entity qualifies as a civil operator as long as it follows the rules like any other civil operator. You can be a business, a government, you can be an individual. You have to operate, to stay civil cleanly, you have to operate in accordance with all of the rules that apply to that civil operation. Most UAS is Part 107. It could be Part 91 if you have a bigger aircraft. And believe it or not, they're going to be 135 at some point. You can conduct any operation that falls within the scope of your authority. There's no limitation on what you do, to take pictures, to goof around, as long as you do it legally. Thank you. You can charge for your services or be compensated for the operation within the limits of your operating authority. There are limits on compensation in some of those. But if you choose to be public aircraft, you are limited. People think it is some sort of panacea that I'm going to be a public aircraft operation. I can do what I want, when I want, no restrictions, no nothing. Oh, unfortunately, that's not the case. The restrictions are actually tighter before you get off the ground. So, limits you to self-certification of your aircraft, which does not mean you don't have to do anything. You pull that UAS out of the box and charge it and fly it? No. It means you are 100% responsible for the aircraft and the operation and the schoolyard full of kids you crash into. You are limited to operation in the airspace described in your application because, yes, this is something you have to come to us to get permission for. The applicant must qualify as a government entity, and yes, there's paperwork. The operation's limited to the applicant, like the Chicago Police Department, but it actually the public aircraft authority goes to the city of Chicago on behalf to be used by the police department, which means they can't give it to someone else. I'm from Chicago, by the way, so I like to use them as an example. You have to have a valid governmental function on every flight. Use by another part of the same government probably requires a different authority, not that PAO certificate, that COA, that certificate of authorization that you got. You cannot charge, you cannot be compensated, you don't have the use of LANCE, you have to have a COA, a certificate of authorization or waiver. COAs expire and have to be renewed, and COAs can be pulled by the FAA. If you choose to be 107, you get stuff up front. You get operations up to 400 feet in Class G airspace. There's no limited governmental function. There's no reimbursement restriction. You get to use Lance, and you get to apply for one of that whole slew of waivers that are not all on here. Interesting. Okay. But there's a whole list of waivers in 14 CFR Part 107, Section 205, of things you can request. So, what do you need to think about? Every government entity qualifies to be a civil operator when it operates within the limits of the civil authority you've chosen. After all this, if you're still wondering if you're 107 or if you're PAO, you may still need to be PAO. Chances are you can probably operate 107 and get everything you need. It is a rare, larger entities that need to be PAO, but maybe your aircraft weighs more than 55 pounds. Maybe you need routine altitude or airspace that is outside of 107 and isn't really good for a waiver. Maybe your function isn't going to work in Part 107, like if you're mosquito spraying. But if you can't articulate at least one specific reason you need to operate PAO, you probably don't have enough information to make an informed choice. And it affects legally your authority to operate. And I'm done.
Thank you. I'm Rick Hasna with Alameda County Sheriffs in California. I'm going to limit what I say because of what she said. Just kidding. We're a pretty large agency. We have over 1,000 deputies on our agency, and we are also the mutual aid coordinator basically from half the state, from Monterey to the Oregon border on the coastal 16 counties, which has given us a lot of business on the UAS side, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, about the fires and things like that. If you're going to start a program, we met a lot of resistance in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, but we did a lot of outreach with community and met with the ACLU on the local and national levels, and came to some agreement. This one here, the top picture on the right, was the Board of Supervisors meeting. There was 300 people. One was in support. They put a Predator drone out front, and we walked in with our small, UAS system. And they also, one city put a license to shoot down our drones for $1. So it was interesting times. Since then, we really moved in a big direction, right? We have over close to 600 missions with thousands of flights. We usually fly a minimum of 1 flight a day now. We're up to 25 to 30 operators, and we have about 32 UAS systems. The idea is to get them in the patrol vehicles, and so that we can launch them from scenes. We try and take a leadership role as well. We were one of the first to start out in California, and so there was a lot of concern that the government would reach out and be over-restrictive for what we wanted to do, so we wanted to be a part of that. So we've testified here in Washington as well as at the state capitol. The different types of aircraft we have, I think made a mistake that a lot of the early adopters did, is we went out and bought these military-grade UAS systems at about $45,000 a piece. And with our forward thinking, we bought 2. They were the most unstable aircraft that we ever flown. I had the AP Press come out and do a story on us, and as soon as I went to pick it up, it flipped over. And I said, it must have been stuck on the ground and with the grass. And so I launched it again, not knowing if it would flip over or not. But we actually only flew those on 2 missions, and like most early adopters, we would go and visit them, and they had hit the police building during a demonstration for their council, put it in the lake. We did that as well. So we started to purchase off-the-shelf products, right, DJI and others like that. And I am a big advocate of start small, inexpensive, because you push it in training, and we fly very conservative on our missions, but you're going to have incidents, right, where they're going to hit trees, hard land, and it's a lot easier to accept that when you're spending $1,000 to $2,000 compared to $40 or $50, $60,000. You may have your program go under because of that. Let's see where we're at. So we use a wide variety, right? I don't think there's one aircraft that fits the needs for all. So we've done some indoor flying with some of the smaller ones. We have ones that we use for mapping that I've assigned to every team member that we do the 3D mapping. Then we have the Inspires with thermal cameras, and then we just picked up a few matrices. Also, the other one for law enforcement, this is what I say, first responders to use, if you're going to use the DJI product, is the Mavic Enterprise Duo. Has a thermal and color camera and overlay, and there's some pretty interesting technology. The other thing is, if you don't spend a lot of money, you can stay at the leading edge of the technology. It's changing so rapidly, and that's where we want to be. I always look for other aircraft. I've traveled all over the world doing that. And I have a lot of companies come out, and we're open to looking at everybody's product. So I think it's good to do that. It's kind of along the lines of what a public aircraft missions are. That's what we do, right? So crime prevention, post-crime scenes. We've done some pretty major murder investigations and the fires, disaster relief. Every day we do high-risk search warrants, and then we do a lot of urban as well as rural fires. It's hard to see in this one. Usually I have video, but we didn't have time for all that. There was a murder-suicide in that lake, and we got up and located the van that was underwater that nobody could see. The top right one is our psych hospital, where a person was released as okay, fit for society. He immediately climbed on the roof, started pulling the pipes apart and throwing them at everybody. So we launched 3 UAS, spotted him up there, and directed officers to him. We do. That's our goal, though, is to get them out to the patrol officers and on fire engines as well. This is some of the fires that we've been to and mapped. We have a jurisdictional COA for our entire county. We have 3 controlled airports, both 2 are Class D and 1 is Class C, and we get emergency addendums for San Francisco's Class B airspace if needed. And that's the statutes for what we fly in. We do a lot of training. We test within our agency for operators, and I give them like our broad area COA to study and a chart that shows airspace in our area, and then give them a week or 2 to study that, call them in for an interview, and pose, thought-provoking questions to understand what their mindset is and their maturity level, and then what they have studied here. And then we do our own self-certification course. It's a 40-hour course, and we require that all of our operators are 107. I like the idea of having a written exam provided by the FAA to go in their training file. And then I do a flight test, so a practical exercise during the training, and a written exam as well, so that all of that's documented. And then we fly, or we do training once a month for 8 hours a day. A lot goes into planning, right? And especially in some of these fires where we had TFRs in place by CAL FIRE, and at first they didn't want us anywhere near this fire. So I came up with a kind of a deconfliction risk analysis document and met with their air boss. We went over that, and within a day we were flying. I had 16 agencies come up and started the mapping. We've done now, over the last 3 years, multiple fires, and we have a really good relationship with CAL FIRE now. We get into the TFRs all the time, but the safety is the priority, right? And so when we get these teams up there, I actually bring instructors up there to teach them how to safely manage in a fire zone with high trees and different winds and things like that. And the thought is never, not one accident or incident with manned and unmanned, and that we've been successful with that. These are some, I don't have time to really explain, but these are some of the types of incidents that we're on. This is an officer-involved shooting. He was shot in the head, and then another officer picked him up and chased him, and then the guy ran into a residential area, and the officer hit him with his car. Guy got up and center punched the officer in the chest, who was not wearing a vest, and then we searched the yards and determined which house he was in, and then I flew for the SWAT team before they were going to make entry on the place. This ghost ship fire, you may have heard about this one in Oakland. 35 or 36 people, young people, were killed in this fire. And the debris field was so high, about 15 feet up, that you couldn't see. The fire department didn't know exactly where the bodies were to get them out. So we got onto the building next to it and were flying between the steel girders to pick out with our thermal cameras individuals that were in the debris field. And that's a starting of a 3D model that we did for that. These are, again, up at the fires, and it's important because there's a lot of people, search and rescue, fire, even our law enforcement walking around. So I want a sterile cockpit, so I had them spray paint landing zones. You can see we have bordered with tape, 2 operators there, and we had these all over the place as we did flying. And this is more of it where I brought up other agencies that we had trained. I don't know if you guys heard about this one, but two women from Washington State had 5 adopted kids, drove down the highway in California, went over the cliff. It was a suicide, and they had us come up there and look for a couple of the missing kids, and then we did a 3D model of that as well. And that works really good for coastal searches. We just take the aircraft down over the side, turn it inbound, and you can really get a good look inside the crevices of the cliffs. These are more of the fires. Firestorm. Carjacking, that's 3 teams making a search with the UAS. And in that one picture, you can see there's a couple of them up there. I usually have one up as Overwatch. We work all this out before we depart. So I'll say, okay, you're at 300, and you don't go below 300, but you can go to 350. And then I just stagger down with that, and it's worked out really well for us. This is this is pretty cool. This is just with a little Mavic with a thermal camera and a color camera overlay. So the overlay of the color camera actually gives you outlines of individuals, street posts, things that could be hazard to us for flying at night. This is a sideshow in Oakland. So sideshow, like many people ask, is this kind of like cruising? Yeah, it is. They take over an intersection. The people in the car take their guns out and start firing them in the air. And then they have other people riding bikes and touching the car. this happens often too, if they run into somebody and launch the crowd, then the other spectators pull the guy out or woman, and the fight's on, and then they destroy their vehicle. Good times. This is pretty cool too. So this is a barricaded suspect, and the windows were ported and breached, and so that we could look in with our thermal camera and clearly show the incident inside. And before this, they sent the dog in. We could see where the dog was detecting what room, so they had an idea of where the suspect was. And then we watched their entry, and that's the suspect on the ground who had done a lot of self-infliction to his body, and they were tending to his injuries. Yeah, this is the campfire, the most recent one. This is kind of the new normal now up there. So we took 70,000 photographs in a 2-day period and mapped the entire county, 3D mapped it in 2 days with 16 teams. Pretty impressive. That's the operational area. That's the entire teams. And that's what we do. We do this mapping a lot now for traffic accidents, fatalities, homicide scenes, quite a bit. This is in San Francisco at Fleet Week. And this is in the a mountain lion. It was tracked, and we picked it up on the UAS with our thermal, and then it was darted. Retention of data, very important, right? What are you going to do with it? Most people have body-worn cameras, so we do 3 years, and we retain all of our data. And we're working with Axon to do a feed to evidence.com to make it easier right from our UAS. That's me. Thank you.
Nice job. So I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to look at me. Unfortunate for you this morning. My name is Charles Werner. I'm the retired fire chief from Charlottesville, Virginia, and unfortunately, before I could retire in 2015, the FAA regulations were too stringent for me to really go anywhere and do anything. So in 2016, I moved over to the Virginia Department of Emergency Management and worked there with both that agency as well as the Alameda County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Team to help get a team started. I don't know if Darren Goodbar's here or not, but he helped to train, he trained the people that were in both those programs. But what I'm here to do is I'm also the Director of Drone Responders Public Safety Alliance, which all of you here, if you have anything to do with drones, go to droneresponders.org and sign up and join, because we're going to have a conversation with everybody involved. But now what I'm here for really is to tell you how to make every public agency qualify for flight. No, not really. What I want to do is to cover some different angles of the different opportunities to fly. So there, in my opinion, there are 4 different ways that you can fly as a public agency. And I'll vary that a little bit. So one is through a certificate of authorization, which Karen pointed out. That's a blanket COA is one of those. And a blanket COA is kind of interesting because it's a pretty quick process, and it gives you the immediacy of being able to fly at night under conditions and to fly over people that you control the perimeter of as a public agency. I'm just waiting for the buzz to come where she says, get him off the stage. The other one is a jurisdictional COA. That gets more specific to your jurisdiction. It looks at your properties, your airports, and those kind of things, and help you coordinate those things in advance so that you can move more quickly. The third is, as a public agency, you don't need to fly as a public agency. You can fly under Part 107 under the commercial. What's different between the COA and Part 107 is that Part 107 gives you some nuances that COAs don't. Part 107 lets you do those other flights that don't qualify as public agency flights. Part 107 allows you to fly without a visual observer, where a COA does not. A COA requires you to have a visual observer. And that could become very interesting, because if you arrive first at a huge derailment and you want a quick glance of what does this look like, as under Part 107, you can fly, take a quick look. It has very low risk as far as your flight, and you can see what does the magnitude of this look like, or even floods and that kind of stuff, without having a visual observer. And then the fourth way to fly is a combination of those 4, COA, Part 107, any way that you can combine those and do both. And what the standards are out there with both APSA's Accreditation Commission and the NFPA both recommend, if you're going to have a UAS program, that you have all of your personnel certified as Part 107. That's a policy issue. That is a liability issue. It ensures that your people who are going to be flying as pilots, and that's what they are, will understand the national airspace. And that's really important. The one thing about a COA that's good and bad is under a COA you can self-certify. That's good. Under a COA you can self-certify. That can also be bad. And that's where you can actually train your own people based on your own requirements that may or may not have Part 107, not recommended, and it's very dangerous. So I just wanted to point that out. Technically, you could go and buy one out of the box, read the manual to people, go out, fly back a little bit, and say our people are certified. Now, there would be questions later, and if there's an accident, you're going to be in big trouble. So don't do that. What we found is most agencies are doing both because you do have the flexibility of flying under any of the different types of conditions. The one thing you have to that you have to note is you have to decide what set of rules you're going to fly under from the beginning of the mission to the end. You can't kind of change halfway through the process and say, I want to do something different. And having said that, I want to point out that we have so many opportunities and the use cases are huge. Last year, as an example, I put together 6 videos to show kind of a combination of the things that were out there on YouTube. This year, I couldn't cover in a video in 30 minutes all the use cases that we're now seeing from public safety and how to do that. But I want to go back to one thing Karen said. For example, if you wanted to do a public demo for your community, you can't do that under the COA, but you could do it under Part 107, and that's that versatility. And I think that's where I'd also like to have a conversation with the FAA to say, we know the FAA interprets that, and I think a lot of the interpretations were based on commercial flights from the past. But, well, okay, we're going to argue now. She's going to buzz me. I'd still like to have a conversation to say there are things that we believe are public agency flights that I don't think the FAA understands. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So after that, I just want to say, as I wrap up, I want to make sure that we recognize the FAA. So if you all would indulge me for a second, is there anybody here from the FAA? Would you please stand? Anybody else please stand? Okay, what I want to say is last year the National Council on Public Safety UAS, which I chair, sent a certificate of commendation to the FAA. And I wanted to make sure that you all understand what the FAA has done over the past couple of years with special governmental interest, or ECOAs as we used to know them, to help us through these missions of hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes. And I think everybody else here will agree with me, is they have been phenomenal getting things for us to do to help save lives and property. So can we give them a big hand? Thank you.
Bob? Nice job. Sure. Good afternoon. So this is an interesting crowd. We're talking, I feel like sometimes we're the preacher that's preaching to the choir. I think that most people in this room can tell us more about what drones can do than about 99% of the country. I do want to tag on to what's been said before a couple of different times. The congressman earlier today talked about how there are gaps between what's meaningful and what is being done today. I think that's an important takeaway that's really important. And I also believe that Brian Wynn has made the best point of the day of the conference so far, Bob's personal opinion, that none of this survives in a vacuum, and that every bit of the aviation, ground and air safety touches each other, and it matters how they impact each other. I joined the military in 1990, so I've been around the government for about 30 years, and I'll tell you, I've never one time seen a federal agency in force in one room on a fairly routine basis ever, for the purpose of reevaluating their own policy and reconsidering, is the way we do business meeting the need of today? Man, that's enormous. And I think if we miss, we can be frustrated, we can slice, we talk about measuring with a micrometer and cutting with a chainsaw. We can be very precise about how we split the difference between Part 91 and Part 107, and all those are wonderful conversations. And they're important rules that we need to follow carefully. However, our purpose as a nation is not to know the difference between those two things. It's to execute what some of the gentlemen on this stage are doing today on a daily basis. Holy cow, some of the things you've talked about today, the case studies, I'm from Kansas. We don't do demonstrations with cars that shoot guns in the air. We shoot a lot of guns in the air, but it doesn't have anything to do with cars. Really fascinating, the different things that people have to accomplish, and that's our task, is are we getting our actual missions done? How do we do that? And gosh, that conversation can go on forever. So I'll move quickly. I'm not much of a PowerPoint guy. I'll move quickly through some of this stuff. IPP role, yes, we're an IPP state. We partner with the FAA, and I'll tell you a perspective of the IPPs, and I won't speak for anyone else. It's an honor to be able to have the ability to have a direct conversation with the actual policymaker and the small army of people. We can put all the policymakers in this room in one conversation and have a meaningful outcome that actually shapes policy. Unheard of. Outrageously amazing to me. So outrageously amazing, I'm not sure is a word, but I think it's awesome. So that's pretty cool. IPP, we've done a bunch of stuff. We've looked at every piece of the program in our particular program right now has to do with scalability. As you look at the difference, what should you do if you really are debating what to do and what not to do and which rule set to follow? Our approach has been keep it super simple and keep it as repeatable as possible. Every bit of everything we do in our airspace as aviators or as participants in the airspace has to come down to discipline and rigor. And can we repeat it in a way that over and over and over is continuously proven safe? We find 107 to be the simple answer, and that overcomplicating anything in aviation is probably not a good choice. So that's just an opinion. That's something that's worked well for us because we think the actual meat of getting this mission done is not meeting that criteria. It's getting the mission done and focus on those things. So that's something that's worked well for us. We've been very fortunate to be able to do everything we want to do under 107 right now. And there are unique missions that reply to that require public operations. But as our attorney talked about, they're so narrow and so precise, I'm not sure we have time to figure that out. I think we just need to move forward and get the job done. So that's, for us, that's been a win. Slide, please, if I can. Flip for me. Slide, please. There we go. Infrastructure inspections are the primary things that we've looked at, infrastructure and precision agriculture. We only do two big things in Kansas, agriculture and aviation. I mean, truly, that's what we do on a huge, enormous scale. Because of that, in fact, I'll tell you, general aviation, Citation 10 and low and smaller, Kansas makes 3 out of 4 of those aircraft in the world. That every airport you go to, if you look across the population of airplanes and start counting small airplanes, 73% of them are built in Kansas. What's that really mean? What it really means is 93,000 people that make airplanes every day in Kansas really can't afford to have anything mess that system up. So we're real aggressive in trying to get involved in this, to empower this next segment of aviation and work with the FAA very carefully and very clearly to make sure those things work well and continue to work well. So we are aggressive advocates of making the UAS system work and using those systems to really make it work in a complementary way. So I think Brian Wynn had that right today, that everything touches everything, and the more we can work together to make those things happen, that's a good energy expended. We are doing a bunch of things with recent flooding and tornadoes. There's a myriad of activity going on in those areas that the UAS has been invaluable. Slide, please. I'm not even going to get into this. You guys have talked about that. We've beat that to death. Why 107? The limitations of it. Good enough. Slide, please. 107 is the simplest answer today to scale the most operations and create the most effects in the shortest amount of time. These particular flight tests that we've done through K-State University have involved about 15 different individual organizations that would never do it on their own. And if they did, it wouldn't be nearly as successful as drawing on a team approach that has FAA people deployed from here to Kansas to do it in person together as a team. Extraordinary cooperation from the FAA that we're thrilled to get to do. We treat our relationship with the FAA like two brothers. We beat each other up a lot, but we get an awful lot done. And it's been very positive in that regard. So we're really fortunate to get to partner. Slide, please. The big green button. This is actually pilot proof. Perfect. PAO. Okay, this is something we learned from Colorado. Getting the word out and getting the public on our side early before we fly the first drone is a major, major win in Kansas. We've taken a great deal of surveys. We've done a great deal of work to go out and work with the local communities and talk to audiences literally in the thousands and gotten people on board with the idea that the value added from unmanned systems far exceeds the burden and far exceeds the questions about privacy and things like that. Having the relationship, looking him in the eye, and having a meaningful conversation that says, I understand privacy is an issue. We're working with you to make sure that remains protected carefully. And yet, we have a neat mission to get done that is going to save lives, save money, and save time. So those things really have been highly successful. Anyone that's working across states, I highly recommend just talk straight to them and have a good conversation. That's been exceptionally helpful. Our regional administrator for the FAA and his team, Deb, has traveled all over the state answering questions direct from the FAA, and that's been helpful as well. So that kind of outreach, I think, is meaningful. Success, we have done a great deal of success. First BV loss waiver. We've done night ops. We've done a great deal of activity with AVSI and other partners across the country. Flight overview, we've done a ton of flying, and it's just beginning. We're on the tipping point to go do a ton more. We're going to start BV loss without any visual observers day after tomorrow. That's a joke for all the FAA people that we've been negotiating with. Operating suggestions, go beyond, now careful with this one, go beyond the regulations really means how are we working with the FAA to figure out there are allowances to do big picture things. There's a ton of latitude to be able to do it well as long as we're completely transparent and as long as we shoot straight. Not everybody shares the same perspective on what's going on. The fact that you're irritated getting your stuff through doesn't mean you're wrong. You probably have a right to be irritated, and there's probably a good place to process that well. And we have done that, and again, that brother-to-brother relationship where we just say, I disagree, and we have the opportunity to have the conversation is landmark policymaking change in the federal government. I've never seen the federal government willing to negotiate and go back and forth. I said no, but let's talk about it. That's an interesting thing, and we're really proud of that. I think that's a neat progress for our government. Lessons learned, you don't need a picture. We talked enough. Thank you so much. If you have questions, fire away. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we'll take some questions and ask some questions of the panel up here. You can text UAS 1600